The morning of March 17th, 1944, Raydon Air Base, England. Major Glenn Duncan walked toward his P-47 Thunderbolt in darkness, carrying a flight plan that would get him court-martialed or make him a legend. Behind him, 8 pilots from the 353rd Fighter Group followed, their boots crunching on frozen ground, their breath visible in the pre-dawn cold. The mission briefing had been simple: escort the bombers as far as fuel allowed, then return home. Standard procedure. Safe procedure. The procedure that had kept American fighter pilots alive for 2 years over occupied Europe. Duncan had other plans. His crew chief, Staff Sergeant Richard Davidowski, stood by the Thunderbolt's wing, holding Duncan's parachute. The aircraft, Dove of Peace the 6th, gleamed silver in the hangar lights, its paint stripped away to save weight, its clipped wingtips giving it a predatory look unlike any other P-47 inches the theatre. Duncan had ordered those wingtips cut after a grit. Taxiing accident damaged one. Instead of replacing it, he'd had both tips removed, then flight tested the modification. The result was faster roll rate, higher top speed, better handling in the dive, better for what he was about to do. "Sir," Davidowski said, handing over the parachute. "You sure about this?" Duncan strapped into the chute without answering. He'd been sure for months. Since December, when he'd watched German supply trucks moving unmolested behind the lines while American fighters flew overhead, forbidden to attack ground targets, ordered to preserve themselves for air-to-air combat. Since February, when he'd calculated that the Luftwaffe was bleeding pilots faster through attrition than through dogfights. Since last week, when he'd finally convinced 8th Fighter Command to authorize an operational evaluation of the P-47 as a low-level strafer. Experimental. 1 mission. If it failed, if losses were too high, the program would be scrapped. If you're enjoying this, deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button, and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Duncan climbed into the cockpit. The P-47 surrounded him with familiar smells, oil and aviation fuel and heated metal. He ran through the pre-flight check, each switch and gauge in its proper sequence, the ritual of preparation that separated living pilots from dead ones. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine coughed once, twice, then roared to life. 18 cylinders, 2,000 horsepower. The most powerful radial engine ever mounted on a single-seat fighter. The sound was thunder made mechanical. Duncan taxied to the runway, his wingmen forming up behind him. The tower cleared him for takeoff. He pushed the throttle forward, felt the 7-ton fighter accelerate, felt the tail come up, felt the wheels leave English soil. At 1,000 feet he banked left, watching his squadron form on his wings, 8 silver P-47 seconds, against the grey dawn sky. They climbed to 20,000 feet, found the bomber stream, settled into escort position above the B-17 seconds. The bombers droned toward Germany in perfect formation, 300 flying fortresses, carrying high explosive and incendiary bombs toward Augsburg. The P-47 seconds wove back and forth above them, watching for German fighters that did not come. By the time the bombers reached their initial point and began their bombing run, Duncan's fuel gauge showed 30 minutes remaining before he'd have to turn for home. 30 minutes. Just enough. He keyed his radio. "Slybird leader to all flights. Bombers are on target. Mission accomplished. We're going hunting." The response came immediately from his squadron commanders. They'd been briefed. They knew what was coming. But hearing the order made it real. They were about to become the first American fighter pilots to deliberately seek ground targets in daylight over occupied Europe. Duncan pushed the stick forward and dove. The transformation of American fighter doctrine from air superiority to ground attack began not with strategic planning or careful analysis, but with one pilot's frustration. Glenn Duncan, 26 years old, born in Bering, Texas, commissioned in October 1940, had spent 3 years learning to fight in the air. He'd scored his first victory, a Focke-Wulf 190, over Nantes in September 1943. He'd become an ace with his 5th kill in December. He'd flown over 500 combat missions, more than any other American pilot in the European theatre. He'd also watched the war from 20,000 feet and understood what the generals did not. The Luftwaffe was dying, but not fast enough. German fighter production had actually increased through 1943 despite strategic bombing. New pilots arrived at German fighter units every week, poorly trained but numerous. The aerial war of attrition favored no one. But Germany's logistics were breaking. Every German soldier in France, every tank, every artillery piece, every round of ammunition depended on trucks and trains moving supplies from the Reich to the front. Those trucks moved in daylight, on roads that followed predictable routes, driven by men who had no expectation of air attack because American fighters never attacked ground targets. Duncan had mentioned this to his group commander in January 1944. The response was immediate and negative. The P-47 was a fighter. Its mission was destroying enemy aircraft. Ground attack was dangerous, drew heavy anti-aircraft fire, resulted in unsustainable losses. British Typhoon squadrons flying ground attack missions in France were losing one aircraft for every 20 sorties. Unacceptable. Duncan persisted. The P-47, he argued, was uniquely suited for ground attack. It weighed 4.5 tons empty, could carry external bombs and rockets, mounted 850 caliber machine guns with 3,000 rounds of ammunition. Most importantly, its radial engine could absorb battle damage that would destroy a liquid-cooled engine. Ground fire that would bring down a Spitfire or Mustang would bounce off a Thunderbolt. In March 1944, 8th Fighter Command authorized a test. 1 mission, 1 squadron. If losses exceeded 5%, the experiment ended. Duncan chose his target carefully. German trucks moving on the roads south of Augsburg, far from the heavily defended airfields and rail yards that bristled with anti-aircraft guns. Soft targets. Proof of concept. The dive from 20,000 feet took 90 seconds. Duncan watched the airspeed indicator climb past 200 miles per hour, past 300, past 400. The P-47 accelerated like a dropped anvil. German pilots called it the diving Thunderbolt and feared it for exactly this characteristic. Nothing in the Luftwaffe inventory could match a P-47's dive speed. At 5,000 feet, Duncan leveled out, still traveling at 450 miles per hour. The ground rushed beneath him, fields and forests and small French villages, everything a blur of green and brown and grey. Ahead, a road emerged from the trees. On it, a convoy of German trucks. This was the moment Duncan had spent months planning. This was the moment that would determine whether American fighters would spend the next year fighting at 20,000 feet or whether they would come down to the ground where the real war was being fought. Traditional dive bombing doctrine called for a 45-degree dive angle, steep approach, steep pullout, minimum time in the target area, minimum exposure to anti-aircraft fire. This worked for bombers attacking point targets, but fighters needed to see their targets, needed to aim their guns, needed time to fire. Duncan had developed a different approach. Shallow dive, 10 to 15 degrees, speed controlled by throttle, not dive angle, long firing run, maximum time on, target. 850 caliber machine guns pouring rounds into the target for 3, 4, 5 seconds, instead of the fraction of a second available in a steep dive. The technique violated every rule in the fighter tactics manual. Shallow dives meant more time exposed to ground fire. Long firing runs meant flying predictable paths that anti-aircraft gunners could track. Everything about the maneuver was designed to get pilots killed. But Duncan had calculated the mathematics. German anti-aircraft doctrine assumed high-altitude targets. Their guns were positioned to fire upward, elevate to meet bombers at 15,000 feet or fighters at 10,000. They were not prepared for aircraft approaching at 200 feet, traveling at 400 miles per hour, visible for only seconds before opening fire. Duncan lined up on the convoy. 12 trucks, canvas-covered, moving south at 20 miles per hour. Standard Wehrmacht transport, probably carrying supplies to German positions in Italy. Fuel, ammunition, food, spare parts, all the materiel that kept a modern army functioning. He armed his guns, 8 Browning M, 250 caliber machine guns, 4 in each wing, synchronized to converge at 300 yards. Each gun held between 300 and 400 rounds. Total ammunition load, approximately 3,000 rounds, enough for 15 seconds of sustained fire. He put the lead truck in his gun sight and pressed the trigger. The P-47 shuddered as all 8 guns fired simultaneously. The noise was overwhelming even through the engine sound, a rhythmic hammering that pilots compared to driving a 5-ton truck into a brick wall at 60 miles per hour. 50 caliber rounds, each weighing 700 grains, traveling at 2,900 feet per second, carrying enough kinetic energy to punch through light armor at combat ranges. The lead truck disintegrated. Duncan saw the canvas cover shred, saw the truck lurch sideways, saw smoke pour from the engine compartment. He walked his fire down the convoy, 1 truck, 2 trucks, 3 trucks, rounds hitting metal and wood and flesh, trucks swerving off the road, drivers dying at their wheels. He held the trigger for 4 seconds. 400 rounds expended, 4 trucks burning. Then he was past the convoy, pulling up, climbing, checking his mirrors for ground fire. Nothing. The attack had taken 8 seconds from first sighting to final firing pass. The German gunners, if there were any, hadn't even begun to react. Behind him, his wingman came in on the same approach, same shallow dive, same long firing run. More trucks exploded. More smoke rose into the morning sky. The entire squadron rolled through in 2-ship elements, each pair of P-47 seconds attacking from slightly different angles, each pilot firing until his ammunition ran low, each pass adding to the destruction on the road below. When Duncan climbed back to altitude and counted his pilots, all 8 P-47 seconds were with him. Not a single aircraft damaged, not a single pilot scratched. Below, the convoy no longer existed. 23 German trucks burned on the road south of Augsburg. The survivors had abandoned their vehicles and scattered into the forest. The road was impassable, blocked by wrecked trucks and craters from secondary explosions. Duncan checked his fuel. Enough to make it home. Barely. He turned west, toward England, toward the debriefing that would determine whether this mission was the first or the last of its kind. The concept of ground attack aviation was not new. German Stuka dive bombers had terrorized Allied forces in Poland and France in 1939 and 1940. Soviet Sturmovix had destroyed thousands of German vehicles on the Eastern Front. British Typhoons hunted German tanks in Normandy with rocket projectiles. Every air force recognized the value of attacking ground targets. What was new was the systematic application of overwhelming firepower by aircraft designed for air-to-air combat. Duncan had proven that the P-47, built to fight at 30,000 feet, could be even more deadly at 200 feet. The dive speed that made it dangerous to enemy fighters made it nearly invulnerable to ground fire. The rugged construction that allowed it to survive battle damage in dogfights allowed it to press attacks through light anti-aircraft fire that would force other aircraft to break off. The heavy armament designed to destroy bombers proved devastating against trucks and trains and tanks. The debriefing at Raydon lasted 4 hours. Intelligence officers examined gun camera footage, counted destroyed vehicles, calculated ammunition expenditure, assessed battle damage. 0 losses. 23 trucks destroyed. 150 rounds per truck. The mathematics were compelling. Within a week, 8th Fighter Command authorized expansion of the program. Within 2 weeks, every P-47 group in England was training for ground attack missions. Within a month, shallow dive strafing had become standard doctrine. But the real test came in June 1944, when Allied forces landed in Normandy and German armour rushed toward the beaches to throw them back into the sea. The morning of June 29, 1944, near the French village of Roncy, Lieutenant Colonel Robert Coffey led 16 P-47 seconds of the 405th Fighter Group on what intelligence called an armed reconnaissance mission. Translation: find something German and destroy it. Coffey found something German, a panzer column, approximately 70 vehicles, tanks, half-tracks, trucks, all moving west toward the American breakthrough at Saint-Lô. If that column reached the battlefield, it would hit American infantry at their most vulnerable moment, when they were reorganizing after breaking through German defenses, when they were exposed in open ground with minimal artillery support. Coffey's P 47 seconds were armed with 500-pound bombs and full ammunition loads. 16 aircraft, 128 50-caliber machine guns, 64,000 rounds of ammunition. The attack began at 3:10 in the afternoon. The P-47 seconds came in low from the north, shallow dive, long firing run. Duncan's technique refined and perfected over 3 months of combat. The first flight dropped their bombs on the lead vehicles, cratering the road, blocking the column's advance. The second flight hit the rear, trapping the entire formation between two impassable sections of road. Then the machine guns opened up. German tank crews described the sound of P-47 strafing runs as the most terrifying thing they experienced in the war. 50-caliber rounds hitting armor sounded like Thor's hammer striking an anvil. The noise was physical, a concussion that stunned men even inside closed vehicles. Rounds that didn't penetrate ricocheted off with distinctive screaming sounds. Rounds that did penetrate killed everyone they touched. German trucks, unarmored canvas-covered vehicles, offered no protection. 50-caliber rounds punched through the truck bodies, through the cargo, through the drivers, through the engines. A single well-aimed burst could destroy a truck completely. A sustained burst could destroy 3 or 4 trucks. Coffee's pilots made pass after pass, rolling in from different directions, attacking from different angles, preventing the Germans from concentrating their anti-aircraft fire in any one direction. When their ammunition ran low, they climbed to altitude, formed up, returned to England, rearmed, refueled, returned to Roncy, and attacked again. The attack continued for 6 hours and 30 minutes. 16 P-47 seconds rotated through the target area, each aircraft making 2 or 3 sorties, each sortie lasting 20 to 30 minutes, each pilot expending full ammunition loads on every pass. At 9:40 in the evening, when darkness finally ended the attacks, ground forces moved forward to assess the damage. They found 66 tanks destroyed, 204 other vehicles destroyed, 11 artillery pieces destroyed. The Panzer column had ceased to exist as a fighting formation. Parts had burned so completely that investigators couldn't determine what type of vehicle had been destroyed. American losses were 0. Not a single P-47 shot down. 3 aircraft damaged by ground fire, all repairable, all returned to service within 48 hours. The after-action report, filed by the 405th Fighter Group on June 29th, became required reading for every fighter pilot in the European theatre. The report detailed the tactics, the approach angles, the ammunition expenditure, the coordination between flights. It documented the effectiveness of shallow dive attacks against ground targets. It proved that properly executed ground attack missions could achieve strategic effects with acceptable losses. Most importantly, it demonstrated that the P-47 Thunderbolt, designed as a high-altitude interceptor, had become the most effective ground attack aircraft in the Allied inventory. German commanders learned to recognize the sound of approaching P-47 seconds and order immediate dispersal. German truck drivers learned to abandon their vehicles at the first sound of aircraft engines and scatter into the nearest cover. German soldiers learned that daylight movement meant death, and that the roads belonged to the Americans from sunrise to sunset. Oberst Hans von Luck, commanding elements of the 21st Panzer Division in Normandy, described the psychological impact in his post-war memoir. He wrote that American air power, specifically P-47 ground attacks, made tactical movement impossible during daylight hours. His units could not reinforce threatened sectors, could not retreat from untenable positions, could not maneuver to counterattack Allied advances. The division was pinned in place by threat of air attack and methodically destroyed by artillery and infantry assault. The tactical innovations pioneered by Glenn Duncan in March 1944 evolved into systematic operational doctrine by August. Fighter groups developed specialized ground attack techniques for different targets. Trains required hits on the locomotive to stop the entire convoy. Bridges required bombs rather than machine gun fire. Tanks required armor-piercing ammunition aimed at thinner side and rear armor. Trucks, the most common target, required only standard ball ammunition fired at close range. The ammunition mixture pilots used reflected their mission priorities. A typical P-47 ammunition load for ground attack consisted of one tracer round for every 5 ball rounds. The tracers allowed pilots to observe their fire and adjust aim in real time. The ball rounds did the killing. Armor-piercing incendiary rounds, designed for use against aircraft, proved equally effective against trucks, penetrating the engine block and igniting fuel lines. Pilots learned to aim for specific vehicle components. The engine was the priority target. A destroyed engine immobilized the vehicle, removed it from the war permanently. Fuel tanks were secondary targets. Penetrating a fuel tank created fires that destroyed the entire vehicle and often spread to adjacent vehicles in a convoy. Cab areas were tertiary targets. Killing the driver stopped the vehicle but left it potentially repairable. The physics of .50 caliber fire made precision possible. At 300 yards, the convergence point where all 8 guns' fire paths crossed, a well-aimed burst created a cone of destruction approximately 6 feet in diameter. Everything in that cone ceased to exist as a functioning military asset. Truck engines exploded, fuel tanks ruptured, ammunition cargo detonated. In ideal conditions, a single 2-second burst could destroy a truck. Pilots became extraordinarily efficient. By August 1944, experienced P-47 pilots were averaging 15 to 20 trucks destroyed per sortie, expending roughly 100 rounds per truck. The math was simple. 3,000 rounds of ammunition carried, 15 trucks destroyed, 200 rounds per truck. The remainder went to secondary targets, targets of opportunity, suppressive fire against anti-aircraft positions. The shallow dive technique Duncan had pioneered allowed this efficiency. Traditional dive bombing required pilots to commit to a dive angle and maintain it through the attack. Any deviation meant missing the target. Shallow dives allowed continuous adjustment. If the target moved, the pilot could adjust aim without breaking off the attack. If ground fire appeared, the pilot could vary altitude and speed without losing sight of the target. The technique gave pilots control throughout the engagement, the ability to make decisions based on real-time information rather than pre-planned attack parameters. German countermeasures were largely ineffective. They tried camouflaging vehicles, but P-47 pilots learned to recognize the telltale signs of hidden convoys, the tire tracks leading into forests, the thermal signatures of recently stopped engines. They tried moving at night, but American artillery illuminated roads with star shells, allowing P-47 seconds, equipped with special night vision equipment, to hunt in darkness. They tried deploying more anti-aircraft guns, but guns positioned to defend stationary targets like bridges and rail yards couldn't protect moving convoys over hundreds of miles of road network. The Germans calculated that defending all their supply routes in France would require 10 times the anti-aircraft guns they actually possessed. They didn't have the guns. They didn't have the trained crews. They didn't have the ammunition to sustain that level of defensive fire. They had no effective counter to American air supremacy. By July 1944, German logistics in France had collapsed. Units at the front went days without resupply. Tanks sat immobile for lack of fuel. Artillery pieces fell silent for lack of ammunition. Infantry fought with dwindling small arms rounds and no hope of replacement. The entire German position in France became untenable, not because of tactical defeats, but because the supply system that sustained military operations had been systematically destroyed by aircraft attacking trucks. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The statistical record tells the story with brutal clarity, from D-Day on June 6, 1944, to V-Day on May 8, 1945. P-47 pilots claimed destruction of 68,000 trucks, 9,000 locomotives, 86,000 railroad cars, 6,000 armored vehicles. The claims were verified, where possible, by ground forces, overrunning destroyed German positions. Photographic reconnaissance confirmed the others. The numbers were real. 68,000 trucks. Germany's entire truck production for the war years totaled approximately 340,000 vehicles. 20% of German truck production, destroyed by one aircraft type in 11 months. The impact on German logistics was catastrophic and irreversible. But the numbers don't capture the human cost or the psychological impact. Every destroyed truck represented supplies that never reached the front, soldiers who went hungry, wounded men who didn't receive medical care, ammunition that wasn't available when needed. Every destroyed truck was another German failure, another proof that the Reich could not protect its forces, another demonstration of Allied material superiority. The evolution of P-47 ground attack tactics created a new type of combat pilot, fundamentally different from the fighter aces who dominated headlines. Captain William Colgan of the 379th Fighter Squadron exemplified this new breed. He'd flown 70 missions by August 1944 and never shot down an enemy aircraft in air-to-air combat. He'd destroyed 43 trucks, 12 locomotives, 9 tanks, and 1 bridge. His gun camera footage was used in training films across the European theatre. On August 28, 1944, Colgan led a flight of 3 P-47 seconds up the Rhône River Valley in southern France. The mission was armed reconnaissance, standard procedure, find targets, and destroy them. What Colgan found was unprecedented. A German convoy stretched 30 miles along the valley road, trucks moving 2 and 3 abreast, nose to tail, the entire road surface filled with vehicles attempting to escape the American advance following the Allied invasion of southern France. Intelligence later estimated between 800 and 1,000 vehicles in that column. Colgan radioed contact report and attacked with his 3 aircraft. The mathematics were absurd. 3 P-47 seconds, 2450, caliber machine guns, against a convoy that would require hours to destroy completely. But the convoy couldn't scatter. The terrain confined them to the road, mountains on both sides, the Rhône River blocking escape to the east, Allied ground forces closing from the south. The Germans were trapped. Colgan's initial attack set fire to the lead vehicles, blocking the road. His second pass hit the rear of the column. Now the convoy couldn't move forward or backward. Trucks bunched up, drivers desperately trying to turn around, vehicles colliding, the entire formation dissolving into chaos. Within 20 minutes, additional P-47 seconds arrived. Within an hour, 6 squadrons were rotating through the target area. The attack continued for 4 days. American pilots called it the Rhône Turkey Shoot. They attacked in relays, 16 aircraft at a time, each pilot making multiple sorties per day, returning to base, rearming, refueling, returning to the valley to attack again. The German convoy fought back. Anti-aircraft guns positioned throughout the column fired continuously. Light flak, 20mm and 37mm guns created streams of tracers that looked like horizontal rain. P-47 seconds flew through it, absorbed hits, kept attacking. Some aircraft took dozens of hits per sortie and continued flying. Lieutenant Robert Johnson's P-47 took a 37mm shell through the cowling on his 3rd pass over the Rhône convoy. The shell destroyed 3 cylinders of his R-2800 engine, punctured the oil reservoir, shattered the cowling, and filled the cockpit with smoke. Johnson climbed to 5,000 feet, trimmed the aircraft to fly hands-off, and nursed the crippled Thunderbolt back to his base at Amberieu, 120 miles away. He landed with no oil pressure, engine temperature in the red, half his engine destroyed. The aircraft was repaired and returned to service in 3 days. That was the P-47's defining characteristic. It absorbed damage that would destroy other aircraft and brought its pilot home. The massive radial engine provided a wall of metal between the pilot and incoming fire. Armor plating protected the cockpit. Self-sealing fuel tanks prevented catastrophic fires. The aircraft was built like a tank, engineered for survival, designed by men who understood that ruggedness was more valuable than elegance. By September 1st, the Rhône convoy had been annihilated. Ground forces moving up the valley counted over 700 destroyed vehicles. The road was impassable for weeks, blocked by burned-out trucks and bomb craters. German forces that had hoped to escape north and link up with defences along the German border were forced to surrender or scatter into the mountains, where French resistance fighters hunted them down. The Rhône Massacre, as German survivors called it, demonstrated the full potential of air power against ground targets. A properly coordinated aerial campaign could destroy an entire army division's worth of vehicles in days. No amount of tactical skill or defensive preparation could counter the systematic application of overwhelming firepower from aircraft that could attack continuously, absorb punishment, and return for more. German commanders began referring to P-47 ground attacks in their after-action reports with a fatalism that bordered on despair. General Feldmarschall Gerd von Rundstedt, commander of all German forces in the West, told Allied interrogators after the war that air attacks, specifically P-47 strafing runs, made it impossible to conduct organized military operations during daylight. He stated that every German movement had to be planned around air attack schedules, that every tactical decision was constrained by the knowledge that Allied aircraft could appear without warning and destroy entire formations in minutes. The technical reasons for P-47 effectiveness in ground attack went beyond simple firepower. The aircraft's design incorporated features that proved unexpectedly valuable in the low-altitude environment. The P-47's exceptional dive speed allowed pilots to attack and escape before defensive fire could track them. German anti-aircraft doctrine assumed targets would approach at consistent speeds, allowing gunners to establish lead and track the target through the engagement. P-47 seconds approaching at 450 miles per hour, then decelerating to 300 for the firing pass, then accelerating back to 450 for the escape, broke the tracking solution. By the time gunners compensated for the new speed, the aircraft was out of range. The aircraft's roll rate, improved by Duncan's clipped wing modification, allowed rapid changes in attack angle. Pilots could roll into a firing pass from one direction, complete the attack, roll out in a different direction, presenting German gunners with constantly changing target aspects. Traditional anti-aircraft tactics relied on predictable flight paths. P-47 seconds flew unpredictably. The massive ammunition capacity allowed sustained fire. Other fighters carried enough ammunition for 5 to 10 seconds of firing. The P-47 carried enough for 15 to 20 seconds. In ground attack, where multiple targets appeared simultaneously, that extra capacity meant the difference between destroying 3 trucks and destroying 6. Over dozens of sorties, the difference became hundreds of destroyed vehicles. Pilots learned to exploit every advantage. They attacked with the sun behind them when possible, blinding German gunners. They attacked from multiple directions simultaneously, forcing defenders to split their fire. They attacked in weather conditions that grounded other aircraft, using cloud cover to mask their approach until the final seconds before firing. The shallow dive technique evolved into a precisely choreographed maneuver. Approach at 5,000 feet. Identify target. Roll into 30-degree bank. Push nose down to. Establish 10-degree dive angle. Throttle back to maintain 300 miles per hour. Acquire target in gun sight at 1,000 yards. Begin firing at 500 yards. Hold trigger for 3 seconds. Pull out at 200 feet. Climb to 5,000 feet. Repeat. Each step had been refined through combat experience. The approach altitude balanced visibility against vulnerability. Too high and anti-aircraft fire was effective. Too low and pilots couldn't see targets in time to react. 5,000 feet was optimal. The dive angle balanced time on target against exposure. Steeper dives meant less time to aim, but faster passage through the anti-aircraft envelope. Shallower dives meant more time to aim, but more time under fire. 10 degrees was optimal. The airspeed balanced control authority against target tracking. Faster approaches made the aircraft harder to hit, but harder to aim. Slower approaches improved aim but increased vulnerability. 300 miles per hour was optimal. Every parameter had been optimized through trial and error, through pilots who survived and pilots who didn't, through gun camera footage analyzed frame by frame, through after-action reports filed by hundreds of pilots over thousands of missions. By October 1944, P-47 ground attack had become a science. The human cost of this effectiveness was borne by German soldiers who experienced it firsthand. Interviews with German prisoners of war conducted by Allied intelligence officers documented the psychological impact. Obergefreiter Karl-Heinz Bosker, captured near Aachen in October 1944, had served with a supply company in Normandy. He described watching P-47 seconds destroy his unit's convoy on July 15th. The attack began without warning. His company had been moving supplies to frontline units when aircraft appeared from the north, already diving, already firing. The first trucks exploded before Bosca heard the engine noise. He jumped from his truck and ran for the tree line. Behind him, 50 caliber rounds stitched across the road, destroying trucks, killing drivers, igniting fuel tankers that exploded with sufficient force to knock him down 50 meters away. The attack lasted 4 minutes. When it ended, 37 of his company's 40 trucks were burning. 53 men were dead or wounded. The survivors had no transportation, no supplies, no way to complete their mission. They walked back to their headquarters and reported the loss. The company was disbanded. The survivors were reassigned as infantry replacements. Bosca stated in his interrogation that he'd experienced Russian artillery barrages on the Eastern Front, had survived tank attacks, had fought in the battle for Kursk. Nothing compared to the terror of P-47 attacks. Artillery gave warning, the scream of incoming shells, time to take cover. Tanks could be heard approaching, their engines audible kilometers away. P-47 seconds appeared suddenly, struck without warning, disappeared before defensive fire could respond. There was no defense, no counter, no way to survive except luck. His testimony matched hundreds of others. German soldiers universally described P-47 attacks as the most psychologically devastating experience of the war. The attacks represented helplessness. No skill could prevent them. No courage could overcome them. No preparation could mitigate them. Survival was random, determined by which truck the pilot happened to target, which driver happened to be in the wrong position when the firing began. This psychological dimension amplified the physical destruction. German units that had survived P-47 attacks became reluctant to move during daylight. Truck drivers requested nighttime assignments. Supply officers hoarded vehicles, unwilling to risk them on roads where American aircraft prowled. The entire logistics system slowed down, became inefficient, failed to deliver materiel when and where needed. The cumulative effect degraded German combat effectiveness more thoroughly than battlefield defeats. An army can recover from lost battles if its logistics function. An army cannot function if its logistics system breaks down. By late 1944, German logistics in the West had broken down completely, strangled by air attacks that made daylight movement suicidal and nighttime movement insufficient to meet operational needs. The Battle of the Bulge in December 1944 demonstrated both the potential and the limitations of German operations under Allied air supremacy. Hitler's plan for the Ardennes offensive assumed bad weather would ground Allied aircraft during the critical first days of the attack. The assumption proved correct. Heavy cloud cover on December 16th through December 22nd prevented large-scale air operations. German forces advanced 40 miles in 6 days, recaptured dozens of towns, surrounded American forces at Bastogne, came within miles of the Meuse River. Then the weather cleared. On December 23rd, P-47 seconds of the 9th Air Force flew over 800 sorties against German positions in the Bulge. They destroyed over 200 vehicles, disabled 36 tanks, cratered roads, demolished bridges, interdicted supply routes. On December 24th, they flew over 1,000 sorties. On December 25th, 1,200 sorties. The German offensive, which had advanced so rapidly in cloudy weather, stopped cold when the sun came out. Panzer divisions that had pushed deep into American lines found themselves isolated, cut off from supplies, unable to receive fuel or ammunition. Infantry formations that had broken through American defenses discovered they couldn't be reinforced, couldn't be resupplied, couldn't sustain offensive operations without logistics. By December 26th, the German High Command understood the offensive had failed, not because of American resistance, though that was fierce, not because of inadequate planning, though the plan had significant flaws. The offensive failed because German forces couldn't operate under Allied air supremacy. The moment weather permitted air operations, the moment P-47 seconds could fly, German logistics collapsed and the offensive stalled. General der Panzertruppe Hasso, von Manteuffel, commanding the 5th Panzer Army in the Bulge, described the impact of American air power in his post-war memoirs. He wrote that his forces had adequate fuel and ammunition on December 16th. By December 24th, his forward units were immobilized for lack of fuel. By December 27th, they were rationing ammunition. By January 1st, 1945, some units had neither fuel nor ammunition and could only defend in place, unable to maneuver or conduct counterattacks. Manteuffel calculated that his army required approximately 500 trucks per day to maintain combat operations. During the first week of the offensive, before weather cleared, he received an average of 450 trucks per day. Not ideal, but sufficient. During the second week, after weather cleared and P-47 seconds began flying, he received an average of 70 trucks per day, insufficient to sustain offensive operations, insufficient to sustain defensive operations, barely sufficient to prevent complete collapse. The reason was simple. American aircraft were destroying German trucks faster than Germany could produce them. Each destroyed truck represented not just the vehicle but the supplies it carried, the replacement vehicle that had to be manufactured, the fuel required to operate the replacement, the driver who had to be trained. The mathematics were unsustainable. By January 1945, the German army in the West had essentially run out of trucks. Units cannibalized broken vehicles for parts to keep a few trucks running. Soldiers carried supplies forward on foot. Artillery pieces sat silent for lack of towing vehicles. Wounded, men died for lack of ambulances. The entire military machine ground to a halt for want of transportation. The final campaigns of the war, from January to May 1945, became a pursuit rather than a battle. German forces retreated toward the Rhine, then across it, then across Germany itself, fighting rearguard actions but never stopping Allied advances for long. They lacked the logistics to establish defensive lines, lacked the trucks to move reinforcements, lacked the fuel to operate the vehicles they did have. P-47 pilots flew armed reconnaissance missions daily, hunting for any German movement, destroying any vehicle that dared travel in daylight. By March 1945, some pilots reported flying entire sorties without finding targets. The roads were empty. The Germans had learned that movement meant death and had stopped moving. On April 24, 1945, Captain James Ashford of the 379th Fighter Squadron, 362nd Fighter Group, flew what would be one of the last P-47 ground attack missions of the war in Europe. He was assigned a sector in southern Germany, instructed to search for targets of opportunity. He flew the sector for 40 minutes at altitudes ranging from 100 feet to 5,000 feet. He found nothing. No trucks, no trains, no vehicles of any kind. The roads were completely empty. He returned to base and filed a report. No targets found. Mission unsuccessful. The report was accurate but missed the larger truth. The mission was entirely successful. The absence of targets proved that American air power had achieved its objective. German logistics had been destroyed so completely that German forces could no longer move supplies, even when desperate. The transportation network that sustained military operations had ceased to exist. 2 weeks later, Germany surrendered. The statistical record of P-47 operations from June 1944 to May 1945 documents the most successful air-to-ground campaign in military history. 545,575 sorties flown. 1.35 million combat hours logged, 68,000 trucks destroyed, 9,000 locomotives destroyed, 86,000 railroad cars destroyed, 6,000 armored vehicles destroyed. Loss rate 0.7%. Those numbers represented the complete dismemberment of German logistics in Western Europe. Every truck destroyed was one less vehicle carrying supplies to the front. Every locomotive destroyed was one less train moving ammunition from factories to armies. Every railroad car destroyed was one less shipment of fuel or food or weapons reaching soldiers who needed them. But the numbers also represented something more profound. They represented the transformation of air power from a supporting arm to a decisive arm. Before P-47 ground attacks, Air forces supported ground operations by attacking enemy positions and interdicting supply lines. After P-47 ground attacks, air forces could independently destroy enemy logistics so thoroughly that ground forces faced opponents who couldn't move, couldn't fight, couldn't sustain operations. The innovation wasn't technological. Germany had dive bombers. The Soviet Union had ground attack aircraft. Britain had fighter bombers. Every major power understood the concept of attacking ground targets from the air. The innovation was doctrinal. Glenn Duncan's shallow dive technique made ground attacks survivable. The P-47's rugged construction made sustained operations possible. American industrial capacity made overwhelming force practical. The combination changed warfare. German military theorists had pioneered blitzkrieg, the coordinated use of armor and air power to achieve rapid victory through mobility and shock. American forces countered with a different concept: the systematic destruction of enemy mobility through air, superiority and logistics interdiction. Blitzkrieg required maneuver. American doctrine denied maneuver. The result was inevitable. After the war, the United States Strategic Bombing Survey interviewed hundreds of German military officers and analyzed thousands of documents to determine which Allied operations had been most effective in defeating Germany. The survey concluded that strategic bombing of German cities and factories had been less decisive than commonly believed. German industrial production actually increased through 1944 despite heavy bombing. What broke German military power, the survey found, was the destruction of transportation networks, specifically the destruction of trucks and trains by tactical aircraft operating in support of ground forces. The survey identified P-47 ground attacks as the single most effective Allied air operation in Western Europe. The conclusion was controversial. Strategic bombing advocates argued that destroying factories was more important than destroying trucks. You can replace trucks easily, they claimed. You can't replace factories. The survey's response was mathematical. Germany produced approximately 100,000 trucks per year from 1942 through 1944. Allied aircraft, primarily P-47 seconds, destroyed approximately 60,000 trucks per year over the same period. German truck production exceeded Allied destruction rates, but barely. The German army's truck inventory remained essentially constant, but trucks don't fight wars alone. Trucks require fuel. Germany's synthetic fuel production was heavily targeted by strategic bombing and declined steadily from 1944 onward. Trucks require drivers. Germany was running out of trained personnel. Trucks require spare parts. German logistics couldn't deliver spare parts to maintenance units because the trucks carrying spare parts were being destroyed. The system was failing from multiple simultaneous pressures. Strategic bombing damaged production capacity. Tactical air attacks destroyed the products. Logistics limitations prevented effective distribution of surviving resources. The cumulative effect was collapse. P-47 ground attacks were the visible component of that collapse. Pilots could see trucks burning, could count destroyed vehicles, could measure success in concrete terms. Strategic bombing advocates dismissed this as tactical success without strategic impact. They were wrong. Every truck destroyed represented strategic degradation. Every destroyed truck was one less vehicle available to move supplies, one less vehicle available to evacuate wounded, one less vehicle available to retreat when positions became untenable. The cumulative effect of thousands of destroyed trucks over months of sustained operations was the paralysis of German military logistics. The paralysis manifested in multiple ways. German units at the front went days without hot food because field kitchens couldn't be moved forward. Wounded soldiers died of infections because medical supplies couldn't reach field hospitals. Artillery pieces sat silent because ammunition trucks never arrived. Tank crews abandoned functioning vehicles because fuel tankers had been destroyed. These weren't isolated incidents. They were systemic failures resulting from the breakdown of logistics. And the breakdown of logistics resulted directly from the destruction of transportation, primarily by P-47 seconds, flying ground attack missions using the tactics Glenn Duncan had pioneered in March 1944. Duncan himself survived the war. Shot down on July 7, 1944, during a strafing attack on a German airfield at Wesendorf, He evaded capture, joined the Dutch resistance, and was liberated when Allied forces overran the Netherlands in April 1945. He returned to the 353rd Fighter Group and resumed command for the final month of the war. He flew his final combat mission on April 27, 1945. The mission was armed reconnaissance over southern Germany. He found no targets. The roads were empty. The war was over, though the official surrender wouldn't come for another 11 days. Duncan retired from the Air Force as a colonel in 1965. He was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross twice, the Silver Star twice, the Distinguished Flying Cross 7 times, and numerous other decorations. When asked about his contributions to the war effort, he consistently deflected credit, stating that he'd simply done what needed to be done. What needed to be done was revolutionizing ground attack aviation. What needed to be done was developing tactics that allowed fighters to destroy ground targets with acceptable losses. What needed to be done was proving that air power could independently achieve strategic effects without requiring perfect coordination with ground forces. Duncan did all of that. The shallow dive technique he pioneered became standard doctrine not just for the P-47, but for all subsequent ground attack aircraft. The A-10 Warthog, developed 30 years later, uses fundamentally the same approach: shallow dive angle, long firing run, heavy armor to survive ground fire. The F-16 and F-18, modern multi-role fighters, practice the same maneuvers Duncan perfected in 1944. The legacy extends beyond tactics to strategy. Modern air forces assume that they can achieve decisive effects independently through precision strikes against logistics targets. That assumption derives directly from the P-47 campaign in Western Europe, the demonstration that air forces could strangle enemy logistics so thoroughly that ground forces faced opponents who couldn't fight, changed military planning permanently. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.